I'm James Bennett, Managing Director of Televisual. The boom in high-end television, HETV, has already arrived as the streamers, Netflix, Amazon, Disney, Apple, and all are already busy competing for the consumer subscription dollar, euro, and pound. And to truly differentiate themselves, they need to offer the very best originated content. And to make that content all the more rewarding and enriching, they want it delivered to the highest production values available, and with playback in common consumer use. Today, this is Dolby Vision, HDR, and Atmos home entertainment, which can create a truly theatrical home cinema experience. And this has a relevance on your Sony Bravia at home or on your up-to-date iPad or iPhone on the go. This competition is going to become all the more fierce over the coming 2 or 3 years, with SVOD subscription revenue growth forecasts of up to twice their pre-pandemic levels by 2024. And expenditure on originated content forecast is greater again. In the UK alone, the most conservative forecasts see investment in HETV content more than doubling by 2024 from the 2019 1.67 billion inward investment, with some forecasts suggesting this will triple, will certainly double. And there are similar forecasts for other European countries like Spain and Ireland. And underpinning the success of any one streamer is delivering the very best creative work. And this demands the very best technical execution. And this, in turn, is likely to include HDR. This webinar is first and foremost a practical session to help you navigate through the choppy waters of HDR color management for HETV. And we hope, if the compass holds good, help you find some dry land. In the right hands, HDR masters offer the viewer a more vivid and immersive experience. If you've had any experience of shooting and mastering to HDR for HETV, you will know that HDR can be unforgiving and requires a much more rigorous set of protocols. It has rightly been said that it shares more in common with a high-end theatrical production, which is far more demanding than a linear HD SDR broadcast. For the cinematographer, DIT, colorist, and workflow supervisor, it is mission critical to establish robust HDR workflow protocols and to employ the most appropriate technology in a managed way across the whole HDR color pipeline. I have with me, virtually, a truly stellar panel of specular highlights with the ambition of helping you find the detail within the workflow shadows of HDR color management. They are all go-to experts with an astonishing portfolio of experience. We have with us Darren Wilson, Director of Technology and Visual Services at Molyneux. Molyneux have an extraordinary track record over the last 40, 50 years almost of work. Most recently for Amazon, they've done Truth Seekers and Sir Alex Ferguson, Never Give In. And for Netflix, Criminal UK, you would have put this one in, Darren, wouldn't you? Don't Fuck with Cats, and Fear City, New York versus the Mafia. Wolfson was previously Director of Creative Services Technology at Pinewood. Next up, we have Joshua Callis-Smith, Chief Technology Officer at CineLab London. Josh has worked on the upcoming Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them #3, Louis Wayne, and previously worked on Rocketman. In all three, he's been the digital imaging technician and dailies colorist. Josh has also been a workflow supervisor for Netflix HDR shows. And finally, we come to my old friend, Tom Mitchell, Technology Director at Mission. I should say young friend. He's extraordinarily young for such a big job. Tom is a co-founder of Mission, who have been supporting digital cinematography with DIT, dailies, and workflow consultancy since 2011, with recent high-profile HDR productions, including BBC and Netflix The Serpent, Netflix Bridgerton, Rebecca, and Behind Her Eyes, and the BBC and HBO's His Dark Materials. And we're ably supported by Paul Cameron, Sony expert at Sony Professional Europe, who will walk us through Sony's HDR monitoring options at the end of the main session. It's really important to stress, my panel here are experts. These are their own opinions. So if I can, I'd like to start with Darren. Darren, it's often been said that when working with streamers that you start with the deliverables. Why do you need to bring the post house on board at the start of the project? And what are the considerations you might discuss with the cinematographer and the production company? Darren.
Yeah, I'm I think interesting, you almost start at both ends and sort of come back into the middle. And so as you say, the deliverables are a really important consideration when trying to decide which workflow is going to be most appropriate for your project. And it's sort of rather obvious, actually. Working back from what you need to deliver to the client is a good point to start from. I think for a lot of these types of projects, they remind me much more of the feature films that I was involved with at Pinewood than perhaps traditional broadcasts. And in fact, the approach of a production is much more like a feature film. I think helped a lot by the fact that budgets are a lot higher, and therefore production is able to operate in that way. But so many things really can impact the way the production needs to be post-produced. So you're sort of asking, why does the post house need to get involved so early on? I think because you want to be involved and understand the camera choices, not necessarily to give opinion, but so that you know what's going to be used. If it's lots of different cameras, discussions about how the fact that they actually natively work at different resolutions is going to work once post-production starts, if they shoot in different color spaces, if the extraction for each one is going to have to be different. We need to discuss that early on so that there's a plan for making sure that that's going to work effectively. Need to decide on a working color space. ACES is obviously very popular at the moment, but we'll probably talk a bit about that later, about some of the challenges associated with whichever working color space you choose to work in. I guess, if it's an HDR show, how many stops we're looking to acquire in camera, the sort of nit levels that we're ultimately going to deliver to, all really important stuff. And it's all going to really, it's all going to impact the decision making along the way. So, once we've decided on camera formats, I should say, once production have decided on camera formats, we need to create the whole color pipeline. We need to make sure we have all of our IDTs out, input transforms, so that we can move from camera into the correct working color space. And then, depending on the particular workflow, there'll be all manner of other adjustments and corrections applied, either on a sort of look basis, sort of LMT basis, might have CDLs per shot, could even have, I've worked on some productions where even secondary color correction is used at dailies level. And again, planning for how that information is going to be carried through the show. I think probably some of the other guys will talk about this a bit more, but you want to be looking at and listening to everything in the format and at the quality level that you're ultimately going to deliver it in. So, if it's an HDR show and you're acquiring an HDR, it's obviously really good to be able to look at those images in HDR as often as possible. Then we can make sure no artifacts are being introduced or anything out of the ordinary comes in there. And so the thing I would really stress, and the thing I encourage, is to involve your post house as early on in the process as possible. I mean, for that very reason, Molyneux has recently launched its production services division. It allows us, I guess, it gives us a reason to be involved in these productions more early on, and it leads to much smoother processes as work moves through the facility. I mean, yeah, I think as well, remember your client, particularly the streamers, talk to them as well throughout. My experience is they're incredibly supportive. Most of them employ people in technical roles specifically to support the process. You can go to ask questions. Some of the deliverable specifications can appear quite daunting the first time you see them. My experience is very, very supportive clients, really, in helping you deliver to them what they need. I hope that sort of answers your question.
I completely agree. I completely agree. I think there's 2 points which I'd really like to pull out there. The first is that you have to start at the end to go to the beginning. This idea of talking to the post house is essential. That is where the project will find its master, will find its finishing. And the other thing is that the skill set resides within post-production as well. That is the other, and I can't understate that enough. You know, across Soho, whenever I go to Soho post houses, I'm always astonished by the level of knowledge and expertise now that permeates in the HETV space. And I can't also, and knowing the people at Netflix particularly, and just how involved Amazon likewise get involved in post-production and in the production, and you know, from the outside, from the get-go, and continuously through the process. I hear that across the board, that the difference between working with a streamer and a traditional broadcaster, HD broadcaster, is completely different. You know, post houses telling me that the streamers come in on a regular basis and have direct conversations. They're not just at the end of a phone, whereas the broadcaster might never come in at all. So let's go back to this idea of what happens in the post house as well. I'm going to turn to Joshua and Tom, who have direct experience, and Joshua particularly here. What happens in the test in the prep room? There was a quote that Rob Hardy, BSC, said to me. He said, "You find your film, you find your production in the prep room, in the test room." What are the colorists and what are the DOP? What are they looking for? If I can, Tom, let's start with you. And what are they trying to get at? What are they looking for in that room?
Yeah, I mean, again, it was okay. What Darren was saying is that it's very important to kind of sit down with your colorist and look through the footage, but the test room is one of the places where you capture that footage. And there's the old saying, fail to prepare, prepare to fail. I think that goes true with any production, but particularly when you're working with reasonably uncomfortable or new territory. You want to just be a little bit more vigilant. When we first did digital cameras, we did a lot of testing. This is sort of, the front end is not being changed, but the back end with the display. So in the test room, there's a lot of things that change with HDR. I mean, Coca-Cola love HDR because you for the first time get to see Coca-Cola red. So it's not just about the dark range, but also the color as well. So things like lipsticks, different colors, different materials sometimes are better, separate better. So much so, for example, in the work that we've done with broadcast, they've actually experimented with using matte white and glossy white, because you can actually see the difference between the two, because the glossy white actually shows up in the speculars. So those sort of different, things that you can experiment with materials and colors and stuff when it comes to sets, props, and makeup. Not just for the cinematographer, but it's for all the different departments. It's good for them, to see the differences. I think we had a conversation, the other day, James, where we were talking about, you would want to know basically what you're framing to with your frame lines, even if you're doing like a theatrical deliverable or a cinematic deliverable. You might have, cinematic versus HD deliverable. Even if you had two different frame lines, you would want to know what you're framing to, what your end result is, so you don't chop off its head. That you're paying so much money to have. That would be somewhat of a disaster. Why wouldn't you do some tests and look at what the end result might look like, up front in pre-production at absolute minimum? Of course, it's absolutely ideal. We can do this a little bit later without jumping ahead. To continue monitoring that throughout the filming process. But
absolutely right.
Yeah, maybe Josh could help.
Absolutely right, Tom. I think that is the point, that you need to be looking at everything in that prep room. And I know people who go, so it's not just hair and makeup and wardrobe, but they even go as far as taking it on set as far as possible. It's a bit like the pre-light days, going back to Hollywood, and how before you went and shot a feature film, you'd go out with your film stock and you do proper full tests, take it back to the lab, and that would be your look. And there's a sense in which we're returning to after a fashion into that world, the need to establish just all of those details to avoid error later down the line. If I can, where does HDR fit into all of this? Because you're not just looking at an image, you're looking at it in HDR, aren't you? And what What values are you looking for there? Tom?
Oh, okay. Sorry, I wasn't sure because you said.
My apologies.
I mean, I think the big difference is with HDR. I mean, I know you know, it was a subject we've been talking about a long time, so I apologise if I'm starting with the basics. But HDR isn't. I mean, yes, you get a slightly brighter image, but it's not its main goal. So all your skin tones and your diffuse whites are more or less luminance-wise roughly where they are. But what changes is your speculars and stuff like that. So what you're looking for is stuff that is adding to the image as opposed to drawing your attention away from it. I'm sure some other people have some anecdotes about various different issues that they have with some distracting items in the frame. So that's the stuff you're looking at. You're also looking for anything that's a bit maybe punchy. What it's like when you've got a bright window in the background. Can you overexpose it? How much can you overexpose it? How much can you underexpose the image? How far can you push it before you see the noise image? And that's the kind of things in HDR you look out for. Because the dynamic range is increased, historically with FDR, you've got a high dynamic range camera, you're compressing it down to traditionally 6 or 7 stops, and so you've got a lot of fudge room there, and what you're doing is to some degree crushing some of the blacks to get to that low dynamic range, and you're significantly crushing the highlights. And so you can underexpose a bit and hide some of the noise in the shadow. But when you're doing a HDR show with a dynamic range, then naturally everything stretches out a little bit, and that includes the shadows. So where you might have like a desk in a high contrast scene, and in an SDR that desk shadow just looked black, in a HDR scene you would actually probably still see the texture of the carpet and also the texture of the noise if that's there too. So often get people caught out. So yeah, I mean, those are the kind of things you're looking for.
Absolutely right. I think and if I can, I'm also talking to a lot of cinematographers, and a lot of them now talk about blocking more than lighting, on this basis of because within an HDR image you can pick up so much more detail, natural detail, and you have that separation. As a result of that, the need to light has changed. Lighting is still absolutely essential, and in fact has become more complicated on set and more demanding, and a greater return to core skills in some respects. But actually, a lot of cinematographers talk about blocking first rather than lighting first. Rather than lighting a scene, they talk about blocking the scene to get the right lighting in. So rather than throwing more lights in and to create the scene. So when you're in that prep room, what are you monitoring on, and what are you likely to be monitoring on, and why is that important? Tom?
Well, like ideally, we're always going back and referencing a mastering monitor at some stage. That's where we want to kind of ultimately view the material on. But in the prep room, you're looking for a reasonably good HDR monitor to get a pretty good idea of where you're standing, and of course, obviously, measurement equipment such as scopes as well. I think you need the combination of two. Scope would be great for showing you where everything actually is, but there's nothing like seeing with your own eye with perceptual understanding of what's going on. You can see something in a scope, but you can't relate what that might be or why that might be a problem unless you've actually seen what that problem is. The image has to come first. It's not a debate whether the chicken or the egg. You definitely need to know the image first to understand what the measurement equipment is telling you. You need to see, for example, a set of headlights that are overly blinding and completely distract from maybe the actor in the foreground. You see it and you know it; it's instinctual, and you don't necessarily get that from a set of scopes. So that's why I think it's really important to be able to see stuff straight, and you get immediate feedback.
And if I can, I'm going to ask you, and what monitors do you run at Mission? What's your grade 1 monitor?
Well, we back at Bath, we use the HX 310s. We've got a few of them for a lot of our mastering. And it's sometimes also nice to have some, you know, some client level, you know, consumer TVs as well to see the comparison of that, for sure.
And I'm going to pass over to Josh. And Josh again, and I think it's a relevant point, and I'll make the point in a second. But what monitoring do you have at Cinelab?
Again, we're using the HX310s. They're kind of our go-to for mastering really, and also checking all our live content against.
And I'm going to be really cheeky here, Darren. What monitoring are you using over at Monitor?
We've got a combination. We've got quite a lot of our X300s. We use HX310s from time to time. We've got other stuff as well. We've got some LCD panels which are designed for HDR monitoring. I have to say though that the Sony, both the 300 and the 310 are really the monitor of choice. I mean, the only reason we don't have more of them is they're a significant investment.
Absolutely right, and this is absolutely right. But the point about that is, and the reason I asked that question, if I were to ask almost any post company in Soho, or indeed any DIT company, it would be that they would answer the X300 or the HX310, but the Sony monitor, which has become the industry standard. The relevance there is that everyone has access to that standard and that has a consistent calibration, and that universality is important so that everyone is looking at the same image at different points and at different locations. Slightly cheeky point, but it's an important one to make. I'm going to pass back to you, Josh. I'm thinking about that prep room and setting the look. You know, when you're looking at when you're working with people on setting the look, and the colorist is working with the cinematographer, you know, is it desirable to have lots of LUTs or to have one or two? And we're going to come back at ACEs and LMTs shortly, but you know, what else are they looking to get in the prep room? What are they looking to come away with?
Well, I mean, I think when you start with prep, I mean, I'd say there's no such thing really as a dry room when especially when it comes to HDR, but prep in general. And like, you know, like one of the key things with any color pipeline is consistency. And just going back to what we was talking about earlier, I mean, I do kind of agree that it's best to start with the finishing house and the DI company and kind of set your look there. So we would shoot tests, and you know, you would shoot with different cameras, and ideally we would shoot as many different sort of lighting scenarios and, you know, locations if they become available. And we would then take those tests and then effectively review them in the best environment possible. So again, this comes back to reviewing these in the DI suite, you know, ideally on something like a HX310 or an X300. And you know, we would take these tests and then start to create our LUTs, or again, if we're in an ACES pipeline, we'd be creating LMTs from these. And like what you said, you know, it's kind of good to only actually go in with a couple of LUTs or LMTs, because if you start creating large numbers of these, they suddenly become a lot more difficult to track during the post-production process. So, you know, kind of, you know, best practices would be to kind of stick with ideally one LUT or LMT and use CDL values to make those corrections for the shoot, or if you need to, just a couple. But you definitely wouldn't want to be creating large volumes of these, as it does make the entire post process a little more complicated further down the line.
And thinking about yourself as you know, thinking about the work you're doing as a DIT and as a dailies colorist, you know, are you constantly going backwards and forwards with the post house? Are you sending them frames? Are you sending them clips to review, or is it, or are you separated at that point?
I mean, definitely during prep. I mean, like I said, like the first step that I would like to do is effectively work with the cameras, the lenses. You know, like I said, shooting your tests in different lighting scenarios and different locations, and then kind of have this all prepped ahead of your hair and makeup test. So then when you go into your hair and makeup test, you've got an LMT or a LUT, you know which cameras you're using, you know which lenses you're using, you know which colors pipeline you're working to, and then you can kind of use these hair and makeup tests almost as your dry run for shooting. So then you can then take these hair and makeup tests with the pipeline that we're working towards, and you can review these again in the DI theater or the DI suite with the colorist, and you can use this as a really good chance to make any final adjustments to your color pipeline, to your LMTs, to your LUTs, and you can then kind of have this all prepped ahead of shooting. So in terms of the prep process, I definitely think there's ideally there's your kind of your preliminary tests, but then there should be second tests. So you are kind of going backwards and forwards with reviewing the material and checking it again on set and again in the DI suite.
And who sets up the HDR color pipeline? Who's responsible for that color pipeline? What happens from the prep room? I'm going to ask Tom first. Tom, what happens next?
Sorry, I was just grabbed myself off mute. Well, I mean, once you've got the dailies part of the pipeline, you've got your what you call dailies, which is where your producers, execs, directors, and stuff like that are watching material for on a daily basis. At the moment, the status quo is we're mostly watching that in SDR, but the technology there with iPads and stuff like that to be able to watch that in HDR. There's certainly, Apple has HDR monitoring. There's monitoring for computers coming along. Apple TV with the HD TVs and stuff like that. So there's no reason why we can't watch the daily HDR. It's what the streamers want us to be, looking at it in. It's the deliverable they care about most, I would say. And the next part of the process is editorial as well. And I think editorial is a really important bit where a lot of the monitoring there, some of it is quite often already HDR capable because they're often using consumer level TVs that are HDR capable. So they just need to be set up and deliver the right kind of files. The way that you're choosing to cut stuff is very dependent on sometimes you get bright stuff, dark stuff, and
Tom, if I can come back, because when you pick up a project from post with the cinematographer, so the prep and the post, they come to you. At that point, you're drawing up a managed workflow, aren't you? You're putting together how that's going to look and what the DITs on set are going to be doing and how that's going to relate back.
I misunderstood the question. Apologies. So I mean, yeah. So parts of our process. So as a company, we kind of end up being in this sort of difficult situation where it's always best to bring the post company and the VFX companies on board as soon as possible. People like Darren and the colorists, like Molyneux and the post companies are incredibly valuable resource, and the sooner you can bring them on, the better. But reality is that sometimes they don't get brought on board right at the start of production or soon enough. What you end up being is in a room with a lot of different entities needing to feed in data or receive data throughout the workflow with no sort of captain on the ship. What often ends up happening without someone putting their hand up and saying, I'm going to take control of this and manage this, tends to be sort of having multiple chefs in the kitchen with no real leader, and it ends up sometimes causing massive issues later on when you're picking everything. So we created a sort of department that manages all the aspects of workflows for people who are specified in file-based parts, with other people managing the logistics, and we've got specialists as well working on the color pipeline to manage that. So we build sort of all-encompassing workflow documents and distribute that with all the entities, so that when the post-production comes on board, then they kind of know what was designed, what was made, and what they expect to be delivered. And we try to work to sort of industry standards as well. So we mentioned the word ACES, which is the Academy Color Encoding System, a system that most post-punk companies already understand. So if you basically work to the ACES pipeline, you know that basically that the post company will probably be able to work with the footage and be able to adapt to that workflow.
We're going to come back at ACES. I'm going to come on to Josh here. I'm going to come, but Josh, thinking about it from your point of view, when you're on set as a DIT and as a dailies colorist, or indeed in your other roles as a workflow super, and how essential is a managed pipeline? Is a clear delineated pipeline to you?
I mean, agreeing with, effectively what Tom was saying. I mean, there needs to be someone that takes ownership of the color pipeline and establishes a clear communication of that across all departments. I mean, if you think the whole idea of a college pipeline, sorry, a managed color pipeline is to basically make sure that we have all the monitors set up in the correct way and all the workflow set up in the correct way, so that we can basically reproduce that imagery in the same way across all of the platforms, so that that imagery can basically reproduce across on-set, VFX, editorial, and in the DI. And I think it's incredibly important that somebody does take management of that, and whether that's done during the prep process and it's kind of handled by the DI company, or whether that's handled by the dailies company or the VFX company, or even the digital imaging company. But somebody needs to be the person that takes responsibility for that. And in an ideal situation, it would be the DI house, where we basically figure out what our deliveries are, we set the color pipeline for the finishing environment, and then we work backwards to the shooting environment.
And again, and just leading on from there, and what are you trying to protect against with that managed pipeline, and what are you looking for? And I keep on saying HDR is notoriously unforgiving. Let's take this into the on-set environment. How important is HDR monitoring on set? And what are you reviewing, and what are you delivering dailies in HDR for? What are you looking for? What can go wrong, and how can you mitigate against that? Josh, I'm going to start with you again.
I mean, we've kind of already touched on this slightly, but I mean, I guess one of the key things is like the dynamic range of a HDR monitor is much closer to the dynamic range of a camera sensor than what you would see in SDR. So say, for example, a log image on an SDR monitor might look less contrasty than a log image on a HDR monitor, and this is due to the increased dynamic range. So, for example, we can't, while we do focus on protecting our highlights, that can't be the sole focus, and we can't crush the blacks in the same way we can in the SDR image. So it's really important that we use our monitors and we use our scopes, so we come away with a good negative.
Yes.
So say, if I example, like some of the things like Tom mentioned earlier, like if we're shooting, come back to my own experiences, but shooting a scene in where we've basically set up lights outside a window, and in SDR this looks amazing and kind of everyone walks away happy. But then when you sit down in the DI at the end, you suddenly realize where in HDR you can actually see all those lights out of the window. So that becomes like a little bit of a problem, because if we was monitoring HDR from the start, we may have chose to light that scene differently.
Yeah, because every single time you want to change something, that carries a cost further down the pipe in post. You hear stories about lights outside window, which in SDR look great, but as soon as you put them in HDR, you can see the cherry picker outside the window shining the lights through. If you're looking at car headlights in SDR as they're throwing down a street, once you think, oh, I can remove the headlights in the background, but once he's done HDR, you're seeing all of the ambient light and the light flares and the light throws that come from those lights. The classic is windows, and how windows can overwhelm the image and create a silhouette experience, or indeed overlight an image and become very dominant and lead the eye. So that idea of HDR monitoring on set, and Tom, is this something that you'd endorse, or it's something that isn't yet a requirement from the streamer, but is it something that you believe is important? Is essential?
Well, I mean, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, is if you see immediately with your own eyes what the deliverable is going to look like, and you're immediately able to see instinctively what feels right, what looks good. I mean, at the end of the day, we're focusing on some of the technical things of of exposure and stuff, but you want to, you're the artist, you look at your palette and you go, yeah, I want a little bit of dash red, I want a little bit of this. You can't see, if you're not seeing the end result, then the second best option you've got is an instinct of what it might look like at some point in the future, and then a sort of visual memory. But you've got to build up that catalogue of visual memory in the first place. But so monitoring on set is key, really, to give you that immediate feedback. You had, when we moved over from film to digital, we went from the sort of light tap, and we went to HD. We had that immediate feedback, and it obviously. People decide, they don't say, right, I'm going to want to go back to the olden days where there was one monitor on set for the cinematographer and no one else to see it, because everybody understands the value of that feedback. Well, it's almost like we've gone back to those old days again. We've got one HDR monitor on set, no one else can see it. And then, then we're not cutting the show in HDR as well, which, depending on what you're shooting, may also, you might change decisions on the way that you might cut something, the pace of something.
Is it easy to bring an HDR HDR monitor on set? Is everything in place just to put that HDR monitor in, or does it require a whole raft of new processes?
That's a very good question, thank you, James. So most technicians, I've discussed yesterday actually. We were sort of debating exactly what was the sort of bare minimum requirement, yeah, you need a relatively decent HDR monitor, and Sony have a great couple in the range. I'll let you, James, detail all the.
Paul is going to give us that again. No, I'm no. That's cool.
You want you've already got all the software, all the tools that are okay at doing it. You've already got the luxes and stuff like that. So the only other really thing is you want a set of scopes that's calibrated for the H range. So those are the two key things. Even 2 years ago, the pre pandemic thing, monitors that were sort of on set were still pretty prohibitive, but there are monitors coming on the market that are definitely well in the affordable range. So that sort of barrier is slightly being knocked down. So I think along with a combination of the audience watching stuff in HDR and the price coming down on needing to be able to do it on set, I think we are at or pretty close to that tipping point. And the streamers obviously they're wanting their subscribers, they want more subscribers, and they're going to attract that with better quality content, high quality content, but they also want to get more money from their subscribers because they want you to subscribe into the 4K subscription and the HDR subscription. But in order to do that, you've got to have HDR content, but not just HDR content, but HDR content that looks good. So that's what they value, and it's not considered a secondary deliverable; it's considered a primary deliverable as far as they're concerned.
Absolutely right, and future-proof as well. But if I can, I'm going to just very briefly touch on it. You touched on it earlier on, but this idea of also that HDR monitoring also has a relevance in editorial. I'm going to pass on to Josh in a second, but I think it was talking to people working in natural history, particularly. They found that having if they were monitoring an editorial in HDR, they would cut in a very different way, because if you have a big view across the Serengeti, let's say, if you're looking at that in HDR, you're looking into that image and seeing so much more in it. While if you're looking at an SDR, it's a much shallower, much less detailed image, which you can pick up faster. It's seeing into that image. I'm going to sort of, because in that editorial environment, you're not going to have the luxury, or unlikely to have the luxury, of an HX310 or an X300. But this idea that at that point, you ideally would be monitoring on HDR, and that could even be a Sony Bravia consumer TV, but the desirability is absolutely there to be doing so. I'd like to move on to Darren here as well in a second, but if I can, from your perspective, Josh, do you think there's a relevance to editorial having access to HDR or looking at that cut in HDR?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely going to have an impact on the edits. I mean, again, it comes down to HDR, and HDR being used as a creative tool, and you can't use HDR in an editorial environment as a creative tool if you're not viewing in HDR. So if you think about the increased detail in HDR photography, like, you can't necessarily you know, if you was cutting a scene that was jumping between, you know, say a bright exterior and a dark interior. Now, if you cut that in HDR, you might not necessarily notice a jump between the two environments. So if you was editing in HDR and monitoring this way, you might choose to either linger on the shots a little bit longer, so it's not actually as jarring in the edit, or alternatively, you might actually choose to use these to kind of enhance the impact you're having on the audience. So you might want to create more of a jump or more of a sort of more of this range. And unless you're actually working with that material and reviewing that material, you can't actually make those choices, you know, based on SDR imagery alone. And effectively, it comes down to, like, you know, you might cut something in SDR and then sit down and watch it back in HDR after it's been graded and be like, actually, that's a little bit jarring, or actually that doesn't quite work, because you haven't actually made those decisions, you know, with the HDR available to you. So, and I also think it's quite important to say, like, I think the switch into editorial will happen, you know, as soon as everyone starts monitoring HDR on set, the switch into editorial will happen quite quickly. And it's not often that I've been in cutting rooms that I've had 5 or 6 different assistants, all working with large screen TVs that are all capable of displaying HDR. So, you know, I definitely think there's going to be an advantage to editorial working with HDR material. And
Darren, passing on to you, and you're working more closely, you know, post with VFX and DI, and is again, you know, where does that monitoring, where does that image review sit? And you can't have 200 VFX operators necessarily working on an HDR monitor yet, and there's an affordability issue. Where does it sit?
Well, you know, just coming back to the cutting room though, I think there are some technical challenges here. You know, we can all sit here and merrily talk about, yeah, it'd be great if we could do this and do that, but if we consider HDR, the key to your image file containing all these stops is it needs to have enough quantization levels, so enough bit depth. And in offline, that's potentially a challenge, because the whole offline process is about creating smaller files that are easier to work with. And so if you start going around, actually 10 bit's no good anymore, it's 12 bit or even 16 bit in offline, then you need much more storage in offline, you need faster networks, more powerful computers. So that there are some other considerations, and I think if it was as easy as buying £800 domestic TVs and putting them in the room, we would all be doing it. But I think there are some other factors to consider, because the worst thing would be to create an HDR environment, but then to, for example, get some banding artifacts because there isn't enough bit depth, and you're sort of chasing your tail and you're looking for problems in the image that don't really exist. So that's the only thing I'd say.
I think that's a very good point. And you know, having worked, I think I was doing some HDR editing on an iMac Pro, but we were able to sort of output that via an Asia I/O box. You know, and it suddenly becomes a bit of an add. So it does start adding on in terms of getting to that HDR image. However, you know, and the additional kit is getting lower and lower cost, the availability to do that. I don't think I'm saying that everyone should be looking at an X300 in editorial. I think that would be absurd as a cost implication. However, the idea that you can do that and manipulate and get that image into an HDR space, or onto an HDR display rather, is coming, and it's coming very, very quickly. Certainly, I haven't had that much challenge doing it, but I do see it in a rarefied world. So going on, if I can, yeah, we touched upon it. I'd like to touch upon it and cover it quite quickly, because I think there are other seminars on this subject, and I urge everyone to come on board on looking at ACEs. So if I can, Darren, I'm going to come back to you. You know, what's your view on the ACEs pipeline, on the ACEs HDR pipeline? What's the value?
Oh, well, I think certainly on paper, it's fantastic. I mean, it's a well-crafted solution to a variety of problems in the past. You know, the idea that you create this container that has a wider color gamut than the human eye, can store, I think, 30 stops in it. You know, So effectively, the container is bigger than anything you'll ever put inside of it. So there's never going to be any sort of clipping or loss at that point. And effectively, an environment that represents the image in the way that it was acquired by the camera, you know, truly representing the way the light behaved in a certain environment. I think that all makes perfect sense, and I think ACES can work extremely well, particularly once it's properly understood by all those involved. I mean, the only one thing I come across occasionally is you know, if you're a colorist and you're grading something, and it doesn't really matter what color correction system you use, you know, you'll be used to the way, I guess, the balls behave, and I guess one complaint sometimes get is you get a little bit of pushback from colorists sometimes. You go, I prefer not to work in ACES. I'd like to work in, you know, log C or whatever it is. And it's a very subtle thing, but it's a way that it's the way their tools behave, and it's a familiarity. And of course, a lot of experienced colorists have built up all manner of tools, or LUTs, if you want to call them looks, that they can very happily apply in an environment and in a working color space that they're used to. And ACES can take them outside of their comfort zone sometimes. But I think theoretically, it's fantastic. It's absolutely something to strive for. And I think particularly if you're working on a show with multiple camera formats, it can work really, really, really well.
And isn't there an issue? Isn't the other benefit of ACES is that it's commonly understood, you know, and there are various post houses, and you're not one, I don't believe, who does it particularly much, but there are post houses, in Soho certainly, that like to have their own secret recipes, their own secret sauce that they apply from their color management perspective, which is all very well and good, but isn't the challenge there that everyone else has to get on board with that and understand what they're working to and how they're working to it?
I know, I'm completely with you on that. And, you know, I think particularly if you work in a collaborative environment, you know, and clearly Tom and Joshua as well, you know, within their businesses, I guess they're producing material that's almost, well, very frequently going to move on and be looked at by somebody else. I think proprietary is fine if you're going to do the beginning, middle, and end of a project. These days, I think it would be unusual to work on a project where there wasn't collaboration with other vendors. And to that end, working as much as possible a universally understood format, using universally understood methods for changing images, allows a much smoother transition of work from one vendor to another. And you know, you see that in feature film work. You see that all the time, you know. And I guess the streamers, you know, going back to this idea that they consider their projects much more like a feature film, expect to use multiple vendors because they want to use the best company for a particular piece of work on their project. And you know, you don't necessarily know that when you start a project. So encouraging everyone involved to work in as universally understood a way as possible, then the greater the opportunity of always working with the right people at the right time.
And if I can, and Tom, you know, I'm going to turn to you. And what's your thoughts on ACES? And is it something that you'd recommend?
Yeah, I mean, generally, you know, when we approach projects, our ACES by default unless told otherwise, and so that's sort of like the primary way we set up most jobs. Every job now is pretty much almost a mixed camera shoot, and almost every job is a multi-format delivery job. So you need what's called a color managed workflow, and you can have secret source workflows to color manage it, or you can use ACES. That, you know, ACES, as Dan alluded to, isn't a perfect solution, but it's a solution that's being iterated on. And I make the point that you can have 100 different companies turn up with 100 different secret source those of which they're individually developing themselves, or you can have 100 post-production companies work on the same solution, and that's far more powerful and also moves the development forward. And you know, and as Darren said, virtually every production is a collaboration. You're dealing with one or multiple effects vendors. You know, post company sometimes are separate. You know, sometimes the finishing is a separate to the DI process. You have sometimes different DITs, different labs, and then also sometimes at the very end deliverables. Sometimes it might be, you know, BBC and Netflix, or BBC and HBO, and so there's also sometimes multiple end vendors also who have their requirements. So you then need to archive for a long period of time, and that's where ACES really comes into home, and that's where it's sort of born out of, which is solving the archive problem, particularly with digital. You know, at the end as well, the pipeline, when it's all done and dusted, as a process of revisiting the material, future formats yet to be invented. It's an incredibly good you know, archive platform, and something that is very mature at this stage now as well. So it's a good pipeline to use throughout. It means everybody immediately from the get-go knows what they're doing. But it isn't perfect, but it is on. There are versions of ACES that are in the timeline to come out that solve a lot of some of the gripes that Dan brought up, which is that ACES has a bit of a baked-in look into it that you have to kind of unfurl a bit. Sort of issues are already in the timeline to be sort of I would say fixed. I wouldn't say solved, but because we won't know when we'll get there. But yeah,
I understand that that's moving forward, and it's going to be less prescriptive rather than more prescriptive, certainly compared to the first two iterations, which people might have come across. And Josh, from your perspective, is ACES the way to go?
Yeah, I mean, there's arguments for both. I mean, some of the points that we've already discussed about, you know, basically most people understanding ACES, and you know, it becoming an easy way to basically pass that color information from, you know, from set through to visual effects and through to the DI suite are all very advantageous. And even just to mention what Tom said about, you know, ACES is constantly evolving, it's constantly improving, and like, you know, even more recently, like what, you know, with ACES 1.2 and the inclusion of the ACES metadata file or the AMF, which is still in its infancy, but effectively this is going to become like another sort of tool that's going to allow us to pass that information across even more seamlessly. Like, you know, it'll effectively include what IDT we use, what ODT we use, what LNT we use, and that's going to make the transition between multiple vendors. And like, even like in VFX, where you've got multiple artists, you know, all working across the same images, like these sort of tools and improvements that are coming out of ACES are all going to make color managed pipelines much simpler and much easier further down the line.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And I think another point about ACES is that if you are working on a sort of much more live action environment, then ACES is perhaps less important. But if you're working on a VFX heavy DI environment, the more VFX vendors that are involved, the more VFX there is in the production, the more valuable that ACES seems to become as a commonly understood pipeline. So I'm conscious of time and wanting to allow Paul an opportunity to present some of the monitors and to get some questions. A couple of things I'd like to quickly touch upon. The first is looking forward, and this idea of more and more post and VFX work happening on set is going to require, and that idea of, you know, 80%, someone said to me not so long ago, of that work being done on set rather than in the finishing house. If you look at a team behind The Mandalorian, there's a whole team on set working towards an HDR deliverable, you know, with compositors and other disciplines, and they're all working, and they're all having to work to an HDR deliverable and working with HDR monitoring. It's key there. The other point, sorry, Sony, the thing that you undersell the most is your XOCN recording format. And in the interest of time, I'd just like to summarize the main point about that is its footprint as a 16-bit linear file recording format. I know you don't like to call it a codec. The multiple flavors of XT, ST, and LT. In ST, you're looking at anything down to an 1/8 of the footprint of some of the other recording codecs in the market. and that has phenomenal benefits. The cost of data, to quote a friend, is exponential. It's not just how much storage you have, it's the speed of processing. It's uploading it to the cloud, it's bringing it down again. Darren, when we were talking before, was talking about how they at Mononair like to work in the native format, the native file formats, the recording formats, and how, again, if you're moving that around, irrespective of the fact you have a lot of SAN, a lot of terabytes, a lot of petabytes in the post house, being able to move that data around faster and more efficiently has a tangible benefit. The idea of XOCN, nobody that I understand has said that they don't like it. I've only heard very, very positive things, and I think that's something that Sony undersell. But we're here really to talk about HDR monitoring and to look at what's there. I'd like to pass across to Paul, but before I do, I'd like to give the panel an opportunity to have a final piece of advice to our viewers. I'm going to start with you, Tom. What would be your one piece of advice to our viewers today?
I'll repeat what I said at the beginning, which is, you know, the sort of time which is, you know, fail to prepare, or no, I'm mixing it up. Fail to prepare, or then you're preparing to fail. I think prep is a really important part of production, and I know it's so difficult, and I get, you know, we all understand the reality. We've been doing this for a while, or how hard it is to follow that. You know, and if you've got no prep, then at least some sort of monitoring on set is now cost effective. You know, I know you're fighting for your team, you're fighting for lighting and stuff like that, you know, particularly as a cinematographer in production. But I would say that you should put that in the same sort of bar of your priorities of what you should really be looking for on set.
Josh, final words.
I agree. I mean, I think it's essential to start with prep, and it's essential to establish everyone in the team and get them all working together across the board. I mean, you know, effectively when you're dealing with, you know, what's going to happen on set and what's going to happen in the DI, and I think it's really important that those gaps are bridged and that communication is established and set up right from the get-go.
And Darren, final thought, what would you say to our viewers?
Yeah, well, I agree with all the comments before, but I would say it's involve your post house early on. So it's not uncommon at all, you know, for production to contract with their post houses almost after they've begun principal photography. I would really encourage you to contract with your post houses at the earliest possible stage, and then lean on them for the good advice that their experience allows them to bring to the process. You know, and once you've made that commitment to them, well, I speak for us, but I know it's the same throughout the industry. You know, once you know you're on the job, you're absolutely willing to put quite a lot of effort, most of which sort of is unpaid, you know, in order to make sure that as far as you can, the work's going to travel smoothly through your facility when it eventually arrives. And for most of us, that investment reaps its rewards so much, because when stuff comes and you've not had the opportunity to prepare for it in that way, you can spend weeks unpicking what's been done in earlier stages.
Thank you. And sorry, I'm going to thank my panelists who've been fantastic. Thank you all. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Darren. That's been brilliant. We're now going to hand over to Paul, who's going to walk us through Sony's HDR monitoring offer. And just very quickly to say, you know, one of the things that was established in the session, thinking from a Sony perspective, was the importance of, or sorry, the universality of the HX310 and the X300. There's a good reason behind that universality. It does deliver a very good, a very crisp, a very clean image. Sony have also developed some field monitors that run alongside it, the PVMX range, the PVMX 1800, the 2400 and the 3200. I'm going to pass over to Paul, and Paul's going to explain that and how that links back to those hero monitors that we find in all of our panels, rooms and finishing suites. Paul.
Thank you, James. Yeah, there are 4 monitors I think it's worth talking about in this session. But 3 of them, as you've alluded to already, are the PVM 3200, X3200, 2400, and the X1800. So different sizes for different uses. The 3200 probably good for general viewing on set, and the 1800 much more portable monitor that you could stick onto a cart or something like that. They're all using what we call the TriMaster engine. This is the color consistency. So it doesn't matter what monitor you're looking at, it's all exactly the same color. In terms of dynamic range, 1000 nits, so good dynamic range across the range. Where the PVM perhaps fall over a little bit is in the black response. They're a much more of a traditional LCD type monitor. So great for on-set work, certainly in brighter conditions, but when you go into the grading suite, colorist suite, whatever it is, that's where the BVM range comes in, and it's really nice to hear that everybody's talking about the X300. This is OLED technology, so the black response gets really down into the dirt, and 1000 nits peak response. But where the 300 starts to kind of fall over a little bit, let me give you a scenario. Let's imagine that you've got a set on a fairly dull room, and you're picking up all that shadow detail nicely, and there's a candle sitting on a table, nice bright point source of light, maybe sitting at 1000 nits, and you pan across slowly to the left, and there's a window there, a nice bright window with some sunshine coming in. On the X300, that candle will get dimmer and dimmer as more of the picture is taken up by this bright window. On the HX310, that candle will remain the same brightness right the way through, and that's important. I think that's that dynamic range consistency, that brightness consistency on the HX310 will give you 1000 nits across the whole screen, no matter what the image is that you're showing. So you're going from one scene to another, the same object, same light source, for instance, will remain the same from one scene to another. I think that's quite important. The PVM range also have integrated scopes. I think it was Tom was talking about the importance of looking at the picture, and that's really important, but it's nice to get kind of that sanity check, just switch on the scopes just to check what the color consistency is looking like, you know, balance, and what the point sources of light are doing in the picture. So all of the PVM range have those integrated scopes, so you can switch to those if you need to, if you don't have scopes available. And it's interesting also talking about using consumer televisions. I think that's really important, that when you've finished your edit, the grade, just to get another sanity check to show it on a conventional home television, to make sure that what you're actually putting together is going to make sense. So for instance, as part of the storytelling process, if you put too much of the detail in the shadows, people are not going to see it at home. So you bring that storytelling detail out of the shadows, do something else with it. But an important point I think it's worth considering is archiving. So when you've finished your production, you really want to archive it in the best possible quality, not for now, not for the televisions we have now, but for the future. And so I think it's really important that we use the best possible quality, like an HX310, that you have all that detail there in the shadows that you can see on the HX310, because it could well be in the future televisions will get better and better, and we'll be able to see more detail that we can't see at the moment on consumer screens. So those are the 4 monitors that I would mention. The 3 PVMs, which are great for on-set monitoring, different sizes, consistent color, all that. And then this HX310, which is very quickly becoming a bit of a standard in post-production houses for absolute monitoring in a colorist desk. So that's my input to it, and it's really good that a lot of, well, you're all talking about the X300 and the HX310, but don't forget the PVM range. They're very good for on-set viewing. And that's my input. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I'm just unmuting myself. I'm unfamiliar with this go-to system. I'm absolutely right. I think the beauty of the PVM-X range is the color rendition, which is consistent with the X300 and the HX310. Yeah. And it is a different monitor with a different use. It's certainly got a value on set, and again on set having the same color rendition and the same color values is definitely a value. And the difference being the single layer LCD against the dual layer with the HX310 does give a slightly different black and different dimension to the shadows. However, it does fit into that portfolio and the universality of the Sony monitors in the post-production environment, in the studios world, and indeed in the dailies rooms with Tom and with Josh. It does lend itself to the PVMX having a good future. There's no doubt about it. We do have some questions which have come through, which is, would someone like to touch upon HDR monitoring on location when you don't have room, for example, a grading suite with controlled lighting, painted walls, etc.? Josh, you know, as a man who's been out there in the field, would you like to comment on the value of HDR monitoring in the field?
I mean, I think HDR monitoring in the field, I mean, you've kind of got to try and control your environment as much as possible, and whether that's in some sort of blackout tent or, you know, some kind of you've got to try and control the environment to make these decisions. But in situations where you can't control those environments, I mean, we need to go back to basically checking our scopes and our waveforms, because, you know, we can't solely assess images on monitors if we're not in the correct viewing environment. So we have to be able to, one, control that in viewing environment, and in a worst case where we can't control that in viewing environment, we should be checking our scopes.
Tom, have you can you comment on that experience as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think the demands on the monitor for on-set use, it is a power requirement. Typically, you want to be able to make sure that it can run a battery of some kind of HDR. That's always been a bit of a challenge historically. I think that, you know, the Sony's new monitors are able to run off battery, which is why, you know, it's really helpful, particularly if you're being portable or in the middle of a field somewhere. Sometimes you don't have a mains power supply in the middle of a field. Those are sort of a unique challenge. As Josh sort of said, being able to have a portable tent, most of the time you can fit one of those in, but sometimes you are already in a corner. We've got the Sony I think it's E171, which is quite a small one. You can get it into quite compact spaces as well.
17-inch.
Yeah, there's 17-inch. And the
600 nits, isn't it? 600 nits, is that right, Tom?
It's a 600 nit monitor, incredible blacks, and the color space on it is you know, one of the best I've seen on most monitors as well. So it's a really good monitor. But again, that, you know, that's it's more of an on-site monitor, so it's, you know, main powered and has a controller. But you know, the great thing is that they've got a large range of monitors in which you can kind of pick and choose your toolbox for the right tool for the job, really. But yeah, you want something that's portable, that's not too deep, so you can get up against a wall. Battery powered, has some basic tools on it. So where you might be in a mastering environment, you might expect to have, you know, external scopes and the grading software to sort of do some of the heavy lifting on the onset monitoring. So you're wanting things like, you know, LUTs and scopes and stuff like that built into the monitor, which you know, Sony have done as well. So those are all really like helpful things, because it means then if you don't have all your DRT equipment, you can load something in the monitor and just take the monitor with a battery and off you go. So that's really helpful.
Okay, I'm going to throw another question. Darren, I think it's your turn on this one. Can you touch upon HDR standards and how you ensure consumer TVs or devices like iPads, etc., will meet any metadata flags correctly? Will read any metadata flags correctly?
Yeah, so that's quite a big subject in itself, and I guess the truth is we don't concern ourselves hugely with aspects of that. So typically it's not our responsibility to ultimately create all of the different versions that will be supplied to all of the different platforms. We create a single master of which the specifications are very, very highly defined. But you know, I guess, I don't know, is this, maybe this question's sort of Dolby Vision question, and in the sense that the system is designed such that a master version can be supplied and then it is suitable for viewing on a variety of other devices, and I guess that's the whole Dolby Vision. Now that's what differs it from a lot of the other HDR formats out of there. One of the challenges, so iPad Pros, for example, are currently being used quite a lot for HDR client reviews, and if set up properly, they can work extremely well. But making sure the iPad kicks itself into HDR mode does carry its challenges with it, because it's not as simple as just, well, up until recently, you couldn't really even just load a file onto it and expect it to play back in HDR. In fact, you can do that now using H.265s, and you can set the metadata tags in the H.265 set displays properly. But in a lot of cases, it's only the streaming media that will effectively kick the viewing device into the appropriate HDR mode. And so, yes, there are some challenges around that, but we tend to focus on the master file and make sure that that's being delivered correctly and appropriately.
Would either the two, Josh, Tom, before we get on to the next question, you don't have to. Would you like to either of you like to comment? Tom.
Yeah, I mean, you can. I mean, the great thing is the Apple iPads come from the factory in a reasonably good state. I mean, I wouldn't compare it to a mastering monitor, but reasonably good. Apple have done a pretty good job. I mean, they spend a lot of time working on their displays, and they do a pretty good job with the calibration. They certainly don't have variants like I see some consumer TVs or even some professional, broadcast monitors. So they're definitely a lot more consistent. But like Darren alluded to, there's a little bit of setup in place, like something like, like basic things. You turn the brightness up to 100%. There's a sort of optimum brightness level. You set the iPads, and the user has control of adjusting that. So that can change the HDR experience. So it's not a perfect thing. You can't kind of almost lock out the device and put it into kind of, these are the best settings. Like I've got TV, they've got this new film mode. We don't have iPads yet, but for a reasonably good preview, an iPad Pro is a good platform, particularly remote. But obviously, it's no replacement for sitting for mastering monitor.
And if I can, have I got time for one more question? I think I have. We have. Could you talk about the user LUT and HDR conversion license? That's a very specific question. Paul.
Wow, that is consistent. I was going to ask the guys actually if they use user LUTs. It's one of the features that Sony have got in their monitors, the user LUT. It's an important feature of the monitors, and allows you to create a particular look, a particular curve that you might want. So asking Darren, Joshua, Tom, do you use LUTs a lot? I'd be interested to know myself.
Darren.
We use LUTs a lot, but not in monitors. So it's okay. So that's not entirely. The only time we really use a LUT in or just in front of a monitor is to make a correction either for that monitoring device or for perhaps a piece of equipment that's in the path. At the beginning of lockdown, we experimented with lots of streaming tools for remote reviews, and lots of them used to manipulate the color in a way that we did not desire. So we in that case, we put a LUT before that box in order to correct for that. In our world, the place that we deploy LUTs is within the sort of grading piece. I'm struggling to think of an example where we would want to put a LUT in the monitor, because that would be a correction for the monitor. That wouldn't be something that would then be carried within the files that we were creating, and that's typically what we want to do.
Josh.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, the only time I'd really put a LUT in a monitor is either one, if I was putting it in there for some sort of calibration reasons, or two, because I was going incredibly low mode and I effectively just wanted to go with a monitor with a battery, with a lookup table installed in that, and effectively just have it as a really small, I guess, breakaway package. But other than that, I'm not really using LUTs in the monitors that often.
And Tom.
Yeah, so again, as a breakaway, I sort of mentioned this earlier, breakaway packages are quite good. They're sort of edge case scenarios. Quite like it when monitor manufacturers put in stacked LUT. So for example, you can then separate out what is a calibration LUT and then a look. So then you can then, instead of trying to kind of concatenate that every time for a specific monitor, then that's always quite helpful. There are I know this is non-Sony, but there are monitors on the market that let you continually update the LUT, which is that is quite useful because you can tie it into software that pushing the color out onto set, and then when you plug it, it sort of then has whatever the last setting was, and you do breakaway mode. So that's incredibly convenient. And I'm not, you know, Paul will have to let me know if that's a feature that I'm unaware of that Sony do at the moment, but it would be high up on my request that you have that capability. But I know Sony have a bank of multiple LUTs you can store in there, but the reality is that you're changing they're being modified. You have a LUT, what's the CDL, and then that's being kind of put together as a 3D LUT. That's changing all the time. So to sort of plug a USB or a USB cable into a monitor all the time when you want to update it is often a kind of a barrier to convenience. But if you're able to continue to update it, then that works quite well.
Paul, and can you shed light on Tom's question?
I'm not sure about continuous LUTs. I mean, what we would recommend using LUTs for is for kind of pre-grading color decisions on set to speed up color grading process. I think that's one way in which it could improve the production workflow, but I'm not sure about continuously changing LUTs, if I understand what you're talking about.
I mean, like you get a LUT box, you plug a LUT box in, and you can use tools that basically you can control the grades and see as you change the grade, you see it being updated live.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that could might be able to do that through the user LUT features. Not sure.
I'm gonna in the interest of our audience, I am going to bring this to a close, I think, at this point. Now, first of all, in summary, I think there's been some various take homes. One is, you know, ACES. Consider ACES very seriously as a default managed HDR color pipeline, which all of our panelists will endorse to varying degrees. But overall are very supportive of. The second is monitoring, and this idea of HDR monitoring. If you are doing a deliverable which is HDR, you need to be seeing that deliverable in prep. You need to be seeing it the whole way across the pipeline if possible, and that includes absolutely in prep, on set, ideally in editorial. There are barriers, however, there are workarounds, and that will become increasingly required. It's definitely at the VFX review, at the DI review, and absolutely and unequivocally in the grading room. The other thing to say is you know, be careful of your exposure levels and make sure that you're reviewing that using scopes which might be built into your on-set monitoring. Darren's point, Tom's point, Josh's point, all of them have said the same thing, which I think is absolutely essential, which is someone has got to manage that color pipeline. Someone has got to be involved with it from the outset. Has got to massage it with the colorist, with the cinematographer, ideally in the prep room. Has got to run with it the whole way through on set. It's got to run all the way through until it gets back into post. The post company, Tom at Mission, Josh at Cinelab, they're here to help. They're here to help you to give you that structure, to give you that managed process, to ensure that you're avoiding pitfalls, avoiding errors. HDR monitoring is part of that puzzle. A very significant part of that jigsaw is being able to see it in HDR and see where it might or might not have gone wrong. Scoping is another part of the same principle, but actually working with people who understand what you're trying to achieve and can support you in that process is essential. I'd like to thank my illustrious and rather brilliant panel. I'm going to start with you, Tom, and say thank you to Tom Mitchell at Mission, Technical Director at Mission. I'd like to thank Joshua Callis-Smith, who's Chief Technology Officer at CineLab, and congratulations on the new role there as well, Josh. I'd also like to thank Darren, who I've also known for how many decades now, Darren? It's maybe we shouldn't say, but I'd like to thank Darren previously in his days at Pinewood, and before that he was at Monair, where he's returned, and it's good to have you back in Soho, Darren. Thank you, Darren Wilson. And Paul, thank you for supporting this event and being there. Paul is on hand all of the time to answer your questions.
Well, if I could jump in there, James, just say I'm here on the set in Pinewood. We have this, it's normally open, bar COVID and all that. It's open, you know, every day. So if any of you want to pop in, talk about the things we do here, then please pop in. It'll be opening soon, I'm sure. We'll be back to normal. And so this facility is here for you guys, anybody to use in the cinematography community.
There are also a whole raft of downloads which Sony has made available, which you can find on our final slide, I hope. There's a whole raft of downloads that are available. There are some offers from us at Televisual, where we have put in place, we ran some features recently on what the streamers want, and indeed run a piece on the managed HDR color pipeline. Darren was on the record in our What the Streamers Want, and Tom was on the record in our Managed Color Pipeline story. Both of those are there available for you to download. Both of those I'd urge you to. They are again objective pieces and very, very thoughtful, very thought-provoking, and very complete and very thorough. So I'd urge you to do that. I would also urge you to go to Sony. Sony have a whole raft of resources to support you in HDR. And I urge you to go there as well. It's been a pleasure having you on board today, or when you come back and join us in the future. I'm James Bennett, I'm from Televisual. Thank you very much. Thank you.